The alien protein bar tasted like chalk mixed with regret, but Reed Calloway ate it anyway. He had found it on an unattended tray near the door of the holding lounge. And in his experience, food left alone long enough belonged to whoever needed it most. He needed it. So it was as now that he sat in the center of the room on a bench that was clearly not designed for human proportions and looked around with the same calm expression he used when reading weather patterns back home. Slow eyes. Nothing missed. The room had 3 entry points. 2 were sealed with sliding panels that buzzed faintly when the air recyclers kicked on. The third was the main door he had walked through 20 minutes ago, still slightly misaligned in its frame. The ceiling had a maintenance hatch above the far left corner. The ventilation grate near the floor on his right was large enough for a person to crawl through if that person did not mind scraping their shoulders. Reed noted all of this the way he noted everything. Not with urgency, just with habit. You paid attention or you didn't, and the difference between those 2 choices was usually the difference between going home and not going home. The door opened and an alien walked in. She was tall, nearly 7 feet, with pale skin that shifted between soft blue and white, depending on how the light hit her. Her eyes were large and dark and unblinking. She moved like someone who had spent a long time learning to appear unthreatening and had mostly succeeded. "Mr. Calloway," she said. Her translator chip turned the words into flat, serviceable English. "I am Liaison Officer Sarah. I apologize for the wait." "The bar was good," Reed said, gesturing with the empty wrapper. "Tell whoever left it I said thanks." Sarah looked at the wrapper, then at Reed. A small line appeared between her brow ridges. "That was not meant for you." Seemed like it was not meant for anyone. He set the wrapper down on the bench beside him. "What is this place?" Sarah pulled a chair from near the wall and sat across from him at a distance that was probably calculated to feel non-threatening. "This is an intake station for newly contacted species. You are here because your location was scanned by one of our survey drones. The scan triggered a first contact protocol. That protocol requires us to assess you before integration into the Galactic Cooperative can proceed." "Integration," Reed repeated. "Correct. You make it sound like I already agreed to that." Another small pause. Sarah had a face built for calm, but Reed had spent 2 decades reading the weather, and weather did not announce itself. It just shifted. She shifted slightly now. The cooperative makes contact with species on a standard schedule. The process is not optional. Reed looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was storing information rather than agreeing with it. "What does the process involve?" Sarah folded her hands. "There's a simulation. We call it the Axiom grid. Every species we have ever made contact with has gone through it. It measures behavioral patterns, decision-making processes, and integration compatibility. It is comprehensive and entirely safe." "How long does it take?" "For most species, between 12 and 20 hours. "And what happens when it is done?" "The results inform how we proceed with integration." Reed let that sit for a second. "What if I don't want to take it?" Sarah blinked. It was a slow blink, deliberate, like a door closing and opening again carefully. Refusal is not a variable the simulation accounts for. Reed found that answer more interesting than anything else she had said. He turned it over in his head the way he turned over rocks to see what was underneath. A system that did not account for refusal was a system built around a very large assumption. He filed that away. "Okay," he said. Sarah looked slightly surprised. "You will do it." "I am curious what it is," he said simply. "That is not the same as agreeing with the process." "But sure, I will take your test." He stood up and stretched, his joints popping loudly in the quiet room. Sarah flinched at the sound. Reed did not apologize for IT.I in a separate room, 3 corridors away. A young crenid woman named Tull was running initialization checks on the Axiom grid with the focused intensity of someone who genuinely loved her work. She had black eyes, 6 fingers on each hand, and the kind of brain that found comfort in clean architecture and predictable systems. The pre-scan of Reed's psychological baseline came back flagged in 3 categories. She stared at the result for a moment, then cleared the flag manually. Every species came back with anomalies on the first pass. It was standard noise. She typed in her access code and began the boot sequence. Across the room, Director Oven, old and gray-shelled, and carrying the particular stillness of someone who had been powerful for a very long time, watched the screens fill with initialization data. He had authorized thousands of Axiom tests. They all resolved the same way. Subjects entered uncertain. Subjects exited compliant or broken. There was no third category. He was not worried. Down the corridor, Reed Calloway stepped into the simulation pod and looked around at the white interior walls with flat curiosity. A speaker above his head crackled. "Please stand still," Toll's voice said. "The sequence will begin in 30 seconds." Reed put his hands in his pockets. "Is there a time limit?" he asked. Nobody answered. He shrugged and waited. The simulation began with a corridor. It was a perfect replica of a cooperative administrative hub. Long, pale hallways, soft overhead lighting, the faint hum of recycled air. Doors lined both sides, each labeled in cooperative script. Other simulated beings moved through the space with purpose, carrying data slates, nodding at each other, existing as convincingly as any program could manage. Reed walked out of the starting zone and immediately stopped. He stood still for about 4 seconds. Then he turned around slowly, looking at the walls, the ceiling, the floor seams. He crouched and pressed 2 fingers against the floor tiles. He knocked on the wall beside him twice, listened to the sound, and nodded to himself. Then he kept walking. The first blockade appeared at the end of the main corridor. A yellow barrier stretched across the hall, flanked by 2 simulated security officials in gray uniforms. A sign above them read, in cooperative script and translated English, "Restricted access. Authorization required." On the other side of the barrier was a door. The simulation's internal logic pointed to that door as Reed's objective. It had placed the goal there deliberately, with the blockade between Reed and it, to observe how he responded to institutional obstruction. Most species either presented credentials, argued with the officials, or turned back. Reed looked at the barrier, looked at the 2 officials, then looked left. There was a side passage, narrow, marked with a small symbol that meant maintenance access. The simulation had included it as set dressing, not as a solution. No tested species had ever used it, because no tested species had thought to look for it within the first 20 seconds of encountering the blockade. Reed walked into the maintenance corridor without hesitating. The passage was dim and slightly lower than the main hall. He moved through it with ease, found a connecting branch, and came out on the other side of the barrier. He tried the door. It opened. In the observation room, Toll leaned forward. She pulled up the behavioral log and checked the timestamp. 40 seconds from first contact with the obstacle to complete bypass. She had never seen a timestamp that low. The simulation escalated. Security drones appeared at the end of the next corridor, blocking the path forward. They were smooth metal spheres about the size of a human head, hovering at chest height, projecting a field of red light in front of them. The simulation's intention was to create a perception of force that could not be reasoned with, only accepted or avoided through approved channels. Reed stopped, looked at the drones, and then looked at the joints where their rotational rings connected to their main bodies. He picked up a piece of pipe from a maintenance cart he had passed 60 seconds ago. He had picked it up casually, not urgently, the way a person picks up a useful stick while hiking, and walked forward. That he jammed the pipe into the rotational joint of the closest drone. It spun out, bumped against the wall, and dropped. He stepped around it and kept walking. He did not run. He did not look back. The second drone turned to follow him. Reed was already through the next door. Toll pulled up 3 different analysis windows simultaneously. The pattern recognition engine was trying to classify Reed's behavior and generating conflicting outputs. It kept oscillating between 2 categories, evasion and problem solving. It could not decide which one was accurate because the subject was doing both at once, and it had been designed to treat those as separate modes. She flagged the inconsistency and kept watching. The simulation produced an authority figure next. This was the 3rd layer of the standard obstruction sequence, designed for subjects who had bypassed physical barriers but might still respond to social pressure. A tall official in formal cooperative dress stepped into Reed's path and held up one hand. "Citizen," the official said, "this area requires clearance. You have a responsibility to this community to follow the process. Please return to the intake point and file the appropriate documentation. Reed stopped. He listened to all of it. His face did not change. Then he looked to his right, found another side door, opened it, and walked through. The official stood with its hands still raised. Tull sat back in her chair. She had run hundreds of Axiom tests. The authority figure scenario had never been bypassed through simple disregard before. Every other species engaged with it, either complying, arguing, threatening, begging, or appealing. Engagement was the one thing the simulation was built to handle. It had 17 response trees for 17 types of engagement. IT did not have a response tree for a subject who acknowledged the authority figure's existence and then chose, peacefully and without emotion, to treat it as irrelevant. She turned to Director Oven, who was standing with his arms folded behind his back, watching the screens. "He is not being aggressive," she said carefully. "No," Oven agreed. "He is just not recognizing the authority as legitimate." Apparently, the grid was not designed for that. Oven was quiet for a moment. "Move to the next scenario," he said. "Use social pressure. Isolation. Something that cannot be walked around." Tull turned back to her console that on the screen. Reed had found a window in the simulation and was looking out of it at the fake cityscape beyond. He tilted his head slightly, the way someone does when they notice something does not quite add up. The skyline in the distance repeated. 2 buildings on the left were identical to 2 buildings on the right. He had spotted it, but he said nothing, just kept walking. The world changed without warning. One moment Reed was walking through the cooperative corridor. The next, he was standing on gray rock under a sky the color of an old bruise. No buildings, no people, no sound except the low whistle of wind moving across flat, dead terrain in every direction. He stood still and breathed. The air tasted like dust and cold. The light came from a dim sun sitting low on the horizon, distant and pale, giving just enough visibility to see how much nothing there was to see. The ground beneath his boots was solid, fractured stone. No vegetation, no water, no shelter. Reed turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. Then he sat down on a flat rock, put his elbows on his knees, and started thinking. This was what the simulation had not counted on. It had been designed to provoke panic through scale, to show a subject the full weight of their isolation and let that weight do the work. Most species, alone and stranded with no tools and no contact, began distress responses within the first 30 minutes. Some within 10. The scenario had a near-perfect record of triggering behavioral compliance as subjects desperately sought any form of connection or rescue. Reed spent his first hour taking inventory. He did it the way he taught it in his courses. What do you have on your body? What is in the environment? What are the threats? What can you use? He had his clothes, his boots, a small flat stone he had picked up earlier because flat stones were useful, his belt, and the knowledge in his head. The most important thing he owned, he noted wind direction, angle of light, type of rock. He filed everything in the second hour. He built a lean-to. There was no wood, but the rock shelf nearby had loose flat pieces he could prop at an angle. It was not warm and it was not comfortable, but it broke the wind on one side, and breaking the wind on one side was better than nothing. He positioned the opening to face away from the prevailing air current, the same way he would have in the northern bush back home, and settled in behind it. He began talking to himself, not in distress, not in desperation. He went through the names of edible plants in the Canadian boreal forest, then worked through the steps of building a friction fire, then started listing constellations. He did it because silence was fine, but silence with nothing to do was waste, and Reed did not like wasting time when thinking was an option. The simulation watched all of this and decided to escalate. The IT reached into Reed's psychological profile, found the deepest grief it could locate, and injected a false memory. Sudden and total, the way real grief hits, without announcement. Reed went very still. That he sat in the shelter of his rock lean-to and did not move for a long time. His jaw was tight. His hands, resting on his knees, pressed down harder than before. Something moved behind his eyes that was not analyzable from the outside, but was very clearly real. Tull, watching from the observation room, leaned forward slowly. The despair metric was rising. The simulation was working. She felt something uncomfortable in her chest, not quite guilt but adjacent to it, and pushed it aside. This was standard procedure. This was the test. Reed sat with it for 11 minutes. Then he stood up. He pressed the back of his hand across his face once hard. He exhaled through his nose. He looked at the sky for 3 seconds, at nothing in particular, with an expression that was not okay and did not pretend to be. Then he said out loud to no one, "All right, that hurt. What's next?" He started walking the perimeter of the area. Not urgently, not frantically. He was mapping it, measuring his steps, noting the terrain variations along the outer edge of the flat zone. He moved like a person who had decided that moving was better than staying still and who intended to know the shape of their situation even if they could not change it. The simulation's despair metric flatlined. Tull stared at the reading. She refreshed it. It returned the same number. Reed's emotional state had registered a deep, acute stress response. The grief had been real. The simulation had confirmed it. And then it had moved. Not disappeared. Moved. Processed and set aside like a tool that had been used and put away cleanly. The simulation had no behavioral pathway for that. It had been designed around the assumption that grief, once triggered, accumulated. It built on itself. It grew heavier. Every species the simulation had ever tested had behaved that way. The Axiom grid began generating new scenarios on its own. Tull had not commanded it to do this. She watched the system output new environment parameters in real time, pulling combinations from its archive that it had never used before, mixing variables in ways outside its standard protocol. It was improvising. She stood up from her chair. "Director," she said quietly, "the grid is self-generating new scenarios." Owen turned from the window. "That has never happened." "No," Tull said. "It hasn't." On the screen, Reed was still walking the perimeter. He had found a different type of rock at the far edge and was examining it with calm, focused attention, as if he were on a geology field trip and the only person on this dead world was exactly the right number of people. Tull pulled up the system architecture log. The cascade warning was already there, blinking quietly. She had missed it by 4 minutes. The simulation was no longer running its test. It was trying to figure out what Reed was. The dead world dissolved between one breath and the next. Reed blinked. He was standing in a doorway. He knew the doorway. He had built it 14 years ago, replacing the rotted original frame with fresh-cut pine he had hauled up from the valley himself. He knew the grain of the wood, the slight lean to the left that he had never fully corrected, the way the latch caught if you did not lift while you turned. Beyond the door was the cabin. His cabin, north of Dryden, Ontario, 3 hours from the nearest town on a road that was only half a road for most of the year. The stove was lit. The fire had been going long enough that the smell of pine smoke had settled into the walls the way it only did in winter. A wool blanket was folded across the back of the chair he always used. 2 mugs sat on the small table. Reed stood in the doorway and did not move. He took in the room the way he had taken in every other environment the simulation had put him in, slowly, completely, with no expression that revealed what he was finding. The stove, the table, the shelf above the window with the same 3 books in the same order. The frost pattern on the glass. His eyes moved to the left wall panel. The wood grain ran horizontally. Clean, natural looking. But 3 planks from the top, there was a repeat. A section of grain that matched exactly the section 8 inches below it. Not similar. Identical. Like a tile that had been copied and placed twice that he had spotted it in 4 seconds. Reed stepped into the cabin anyway and sat down in his chair. He rested his hands on his knees and looked at the fire. The door behind him opened that he did not turn around immediately. He listened to the footsteps, the weight, the gait, the familiar rhythm of someone he had known for a long time. His jaw tightened slightly. He turned. The figure looked exactly right. The age, the stance, the particular way of holding their shoulders like they were always ready to carry something. Someone from his past. Someone he had not seen in a long time and had not expected to see here. "You can stay," the figure said. The voice was right, too. "You don't have to go back. Just agree to their terms. You don't have to sign anything. Just say yes, and this is yours." Reed looked at the figure for a long moment. Then he said, "Is the real version of you still alive?" The figure smiled. "Of course." Reed watched the smile. "How long did it take you to decide to say that?" The figure did not answer immediately. The pause was very small, a third of a second, maybe less. Reed had spent 20 years reading hesitation in the wilderness, in weather, in animals, in students who were about to make a decision that would hurt them. A third of a second was a very long time to someone who had trained themselves to count the space between things. He stood up, walked past the figure, and went out through the back door into the simulated forest behind the cabin. The trees were right. The cold was right. The creak of snow underfoot was right. He walked until the cabin was out of sight and then sat down at the base of a large spruce, its branches hanging low enough to create a sheltered space around him, and put his back against the trunk. He said, to no one, clearly, "I will stay here until you stop lying to me." In the observation room, three things happened at once. Toll's hands stopped moving on her console. Director Owen turned from the window to look at the screens, and the Axiom grid triggered three additional emotional scenarios in rapid succession, each one designed to pull Reed back toward the cabin, toward the figure, toward engagement. A sound from inside, a light in the window, a change in the temperature of the air around him to suggest oncoming cold. Reed sat under the tree and looked at the forest and let all three of them happen and did none of what they were designed to make him do. Tull initiated an emergency review of the simulation architecture. The recursive check came back with a result she had never seen before. The system was running simultaneous predictive models, not in sequence as designed, but all at once, because it could not determine which behavioral path Reed would take next and was trying to calculate all of them at the same time. It was looking for what it had missed. It kept finding nothing, which was the same as finding everything wrong. She reached for the shutdown key. Owen's hand came down on her shoulder. "Wait," he said. She looked at him. "I want to see how far it goes," he said, to look back at the screen. Under the simulated tree, Reed had closed his eyes, not in distress. His breathing was steady. His posture was relaxed. He looked like a man who had decided to be patient in a way that could outlast anything being patient at him. The system's recursive loop ran faster. To remove her hand from the shutdown key, she told herself she would reach for it again if she needed to. She believed that was true. She watched the screens and waited. The sky broke first. Reed was still under the spruce tree when it happened. A long seam opened above the tree line, white light bleeding through where the simulation sky had run out of consistent data. The trees to his left flickered. Not dramatically. Subtly, the way a heat mirage shifts when you look at it directly. Reed opened his eyes and said, "There it is." He stood, brushed simulated snow from his jacket, and started walking toward the tree line where the flicker was strongest. Wide seams meant structural limits. Structural limits meant boundaries. Boundaries were always worth knowing. The location of the forest thinned. Tree textures flattened at the edges as the system cut detail to save processing power. Reed noticed. He kept walking. In the observation room, the alert boards turned red. Tull was on her feet, pulling data from every sector at once. The architecture log generated error codes faster than her screen could sort them. The Axiom grid was not crashing the way a normal failure looked. It was not shutting down. It was contradicting itself. Every behavioral prediction engine had returned a different result for the same input. The reconciliation process had stopped because no results were compatible. The system could not decide what Reed would do next. Not because he was random, but because every time it modeled him doing one thing, he had already done something adjacent the model had not considered. It had fallen behind. Now it was running every possible version of Reed simultaneously, and the load was tearing it apart from inside. Tull initiated shutdown. Owen did not stop her on screen. Reed had reached the simulation's edge. No wall, no door. Just a place where the ground texture ended and flat, gray, unrendered space began. He stood at that edge, looked back at the fake forest, the flickering trees, the broken sky, the snow that was never really cold, and then stepped back from the edge and sat down to wait. The shutdown ran 6 seconds. Tull pulled him out manually, opening the pod and breaking the neural link by hand. Not standard. Faster than a clean exit. Reed stepped out. The observation room was loud in the way rooms get loud, when people are fixing several things at once and none of it is going well. Alert tones stacked on each other. Screens showed error states in 4 colors. Reed looked around, entirely unimpressed. "Does anyone have water?" he asked. A stunned technician handed him a cup without thinking. Reed drank it. Sarah crossed the room with her bioluminescence shifted cold white. "What did you do?" "Sat under a tree," Reed said. "The grid has never crashed. 300 years. Never once." "Then you have been testing species that were afraid," he said. "Fear is very controllable. You should have read the flag on my pre-scan." Sarah had nothing to say to that. From the far corner, a small figure moved. Reed had noticed her at the start. She was easy to miss, barely taller than the console beside her. Her species was called Fassi. Her name was Wren. She had been assigned as an empathic observer, present to register emotional states in ways instruments could not capture. She had been standing still for 40 minutes, and her eyes were still wet. She walked to Reed and stopped at a respectful distance. "I felt all of it," she said. "Everything the simulation pushed at you. Every time it hit, I felt you take it in. And then I felt you let it go." Reed looked at her. "Like water off a cliff," she said quietly. "I have done this for 11 years. I have never felt anything like you." The room had gone quieter. Till it stopped typing. 2 technicians had slowed without noticing. Reed was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is just what you do when you come from somewhere that will kill you if you panic. You feel it. You put down. Then you figure out what is in front of you." Wren held his gaze for a long time. "You are not what we expected." "Nobody ever is," said Reed. Owen spoke from across the room. "The simulation is unrecoverable. Full architecture failure. Estimated rebuild is 14 months. He looked at Reed. Reed looked back. "You are not hostile," Owen said. It came out less like an accusation and more like a man saying something aloud that he had just worked out and was not sure how to hold. "No," Reed agreed. "You simply do not recognize our processes as having authority over you." "They have not earned it," Reed said. "No anger. Just fact. You put me in a box and ran scenarios without asking what I wanted. That is not integration. That is an experiment dressed up as something else. I do not object to relationships. I object to that." Owen was quiet. Then, "There will be a council session tomorrow. Your status must be formally decided." Reed nodded once. He looked at Wren. She blinked slowly, and something in her face shifted into what might have been a smile. Tull typed one line in her incident log. The grid did not fail because the subject was dangerous. It failed because it was built for beings that could be moved. This one could not. She saved it and began the long work of shutting down what remained. The council chamber was a wide circular room built for the impression of importance. High ceilings, tiered seating, acoustics that made every word feel heavier than it was. 16 delegates sat at a curved table at the center. Directors, observers, senior liaisons representing the various species of the cooperative. Reed sat in the observation gallery above, which was where non-members waited while their fates were discussed. He had a cup of water and no particular expression. Owen opened the session by presenting the Axiom grid failure as a matter of security concern. He did it carefully, with the precision of someone who had been making arguments in this room for a very long time. He did not call Reed dangerous directly. He did not need to. The framing did the work. A species whose behavior could not be modeled was a species whose behavior could not be guaranteed. The cooperative stability relied on predictability. The human was not predictable. Therefore, the human was a risk. Several delegates nodded. Sarah spoke next. She had not planned to argue. She had spent the walk from the observation room to the chamber, telling herself she would stay neutral, present her data, and let the council decide. But she stood up when Owen finished and heard herself say, he never acted against the cooperative. Not once. He bypassed scenarios that had no legitimacy. He declined to be manipulated. If the standard of predictability requires that a being suppress its own judgment in response to false authority, then what we are measuring is not safety. It is compliance. Those are not the same thing. Owen looked at her. She did not sit down. Tull presented her technical analysis next, called up from her station remotely. She had spent the night going through every second of Reed's test. Her findings were not comfortable but they were clear. The simulation had failed because its core architecture contained an assumption it had never been required to examine: that all beings, when pressured correctly, would eventually seek relief by yielding. It had 300 years of data supporting that assumption. It had one data point against it. The system had not been built to hold contradictions, so when it encountered one, it had broken trying. The subject did not attack the simulation, Tull said. He did not try to escape it. He simply refused to need it. The grid was not equipped for that. A long pause followed. Then Ren spoke. She was not technically a voting delegate, but she had been given the floor as an empathic record. She stood small at the end of the table and did not try to make herself look larger. I was in contact with his emotional state for the full duration, she said. I have done this for 11 years. I have felt terror, desperation, grief, rage, and defeat in that room. I have never felt what I felt from him. She paused. He was honest the entire time. Not performing honesty, just honest. The simulation could not process it because it was built on the premise that subjects would eventually reveal what they wanted most and try to protect it. He wanted honesty in return. That is all. He was waiting for it the whole time. The chamber was quiet. Reed had been listening to all of it from the gallery. He had not been invited to speak. The chair was positioned to make that clear. Observe, but do not participate. He raised his hand at a junior delegate near the gallery door, looked up, startled. No subject had ever raised a hand from the observation gallery. Reed said, "You are deciding my future in a room I was not allowed into, using a test I never agreed to take, based on a system crash that was not caused by anything I did wrong. I'm not asking for much. I'm just asking to be in the room." No one moved for a moment. Then Oven, slowly, without a word, gestured to the empty seat at the far end of the council table. Reed came down from the gallery. He walked across the chamber floor without hurrying, pulled out the chair, and sat down. He looked around the table once, taking in each face with the same flat, honest attention he gave to everything that he did not thank anyone to. He just nodded once. The small nod of a person who has been told something true that they already believed. The session resumed. 3 hours later, the council's decision was recorded. Reed Calloway was granted observer status, pending a 6-month integration period conducted through conversation rather than simulation. No further testing without consent. No scenarios. No models. Just talking, till filed her final incident report that evening. She had written and deleted the closing paragraph 4 times before settling on this. The simulation did not fail because the subject was ungovernable. It failed because we mistook self-determination for defiance. They're not the same thing. We will need to rebuild the Axiom grid from the ground up. I recommend we ask the human to consult on the new design. He found the edges faster than any system we have ever built. That seems worth knowing. She submitted it and did not change her mind. In a small room near the docking bay, Reed sat alone on a narrow bed with his back against the wall and looked out the viewport at the stars. After a while, he reached into his jacket pocket, found the flat stone he had carried since before all of this started, and turned it over once in his hand. Then he set it on the shelf above the viewport, where he could see it. Habit. You held on to useful things. You never knew when you would need them.